One Navy SEAL in Iraq found a hidden floor in a suspected safe house and descended into a prison nobody was supposed to know about, and I still remember the exact, stale taste of the dust I inhaled the moment the heavy latch clicked open beneath my boots. It wasn't the kind of dust you get in a living room. It was older, settled deep into the foundation, tasting of dry earth and something metallic, like a penny held under a hot tongue. I was 26 years old, and at that exact second, the world I had built for myself, the world of backyards in suburban Ohio, of Saturday night beers on the porch, of planning a life with Sarah that felt as sturdy as a brick fireplace, ceased to be the primary reality. I was in a basement in Ramadi, and the air down there was screaming, even though it was perfectly, deathly silent. Before that, my life had a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. You grow up in a place where the biggest crisis is the high school team losing the homecoming game, and you think you understand what stakes are. My dad worked at the plant, and he'd come home smelling like grease and exhaust, his hands calloused in a way that made me feel like I needed to work harder just to justify the air I was breathing. I loved that life. I loved the way the morning light hit the kitchen table, illuminating the stray crumbs from a piece of toast, and the way Sarah would look at me when I told a joke that wasn't even funny. We were going to get married in the chapel off Route 42. I had the ring in a velvet box hidden inside a hollowed-out book on my nightstand, a cliché that I thought was the height of romance. I was a man who believed in maps, in the idea that if you followed the marked path, you'd eventually reach the destination you were promised. I didn't join up to save the world. I joined because I wanted to be the kind of man my father wouldn't have to worry about. I wanted that specific, heavy sense of duty that I saw in the older guys who'd come back from deployments, men who walked through the grocery store with a quiet, observant grace, like they were looking for a threat that wasn't there. I wanted that composure. I thought it was something you could earn, like a merit badge or a promotion. I remember the morning I signed the papers. It was rainy, that cold, gray rain that washes all the color out of the asphalt. The recruiter was a man named Miller, a guy with a neck like a tree stump and eyes that had seen too much boredom. He didn't promise me glory. He just looked at me and asked if I was prepared to be uncomfortable for a very, very long time. I laughed. I thought he meant cold nights and bad food. I didn't know what uncomfortable meant. Training was a grind that broke you down until there wasn't an ego left to bruise. We became a collection of parts, lungs that didn't burn, legs that didn't tire, and a collective brain that moved in lockstep. We were brothers, not because we chose to be, but because the alternative was falling off the edge of the world. I think of Miller, my buddy from the team, a guy who could strip and reassemble his rifle in the dark while telling a story about a girl he met at a dive bar in Virginia Beach. We spent hours in the mud, our skin raw, our clothes permanently damp, making jokes that would have made a civilian vomit. That's how you handle the pressure. You find the absurdity. You laugh until your ribs ache, and then you check your gear, and then you laugh again. It was a kind of joy, the sharp, crystalline happiness of knowing that no matter what happened next, you weren't doing it alone. We were a single organism, 6 men breathing through one set of lungs. When we hit the ground in Iraq, the heat was the first thing to announce itself. It was a physical weight, like a heavy wool blanket draped over your shoulders, smelling of diesel and burnt trash, and occasionally the strange, sweet scent of baking bread from a nearby village. We were stationed at a FOB that felt like a prison built of sandbags and corrugated metal. We lived in the routine. Wake up, check the weapons, check the maps, run the comms. Drink coffee that tasted like battery acid and pretend it was the best thing you'd ever had. You hold onto the small things, the little tethers to who you were before. I had a picture of Sarah taped to the inside of my locker, her smile the only clean thing in a world of dust and grease. I'd look at it before I went out, and for a second, I wasn't a SEAL in a war zone. I was just a kid from Ohio who was going to have a house with a dog and a lawn that needed mowing on Sundays. The patrols were long stretches of boredom, punctuated by moments of pure, unfiltered panic. We'd move through streets that felt like a labyrinth, the walls of the buildings pressing in on us, the windows above us like dark, unblinking eyes. You learn to listen to the silence. You learn to distinguish the sound of a stray cat moving through rubble from the sound of a human breath. My job was to keep the focus, to be the one who didn't let the fatigue rot the decision-making process. I was good at it. I was the guy who could scan a sector and know exactly where the shadows were deep enough to hide a man. I took pride in that. I was the guy who protected his own. I felt in those quiet hours that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was trained to do. But the city, that place, was a hungry thing. It didn't care about our training or our mission parameters. It just sat there, waiting for us to make a mistake. We'd been hitting safe houses for weeks, chasing rumors, following leads that usually went nowhere. It was a game of cat and mouse where the cat was getting tired and the mouse had a million holes to run into. On that Thursday, the sun was a white hammer against the sky. We were clearing a residential structure on the edge of the district. It looked like any other house, peeling paint, a courtyard filled with refuse, a sense of having been abandoned in a hurry. We moved through the rooms with that practiced, fluid motion that felt like muscle memory. Every corner, every doorway, a potential end to everything. I was in the kitchen, the floor tiled with cracked, uneven slate. I remember noticing a rug, a woven thing dusty and faded, pushed up against the wall near a cabinet that hung by a single, rusted hinge. My foot caught on the edge of it. It didn't slide, it bunched. I looked down and the floorboards underneath didn't match the rest of the room. They were too clean, too precise. I signaled for Miller to hold. I knelt, my gear clinking softly, the sound amplified 1,000 times in the stillness of the house. I pried at the edge of the wood with my knife. It groaned, a low, dying sound, and gave way. It wasn't a trapdoor, not in the sense of a hidden compartment for documents or cash. It was a hatch. A heavy, iron-ringed hatch that led down into a darkness that seemed to swallow the light of my tactical torch. I didn't think, I just descended. The ladder was wet, slick with something that made my gloves slide. I went down into the belly of the building, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs that felt like a countdown. As I reached the bottom, the beam of my light cut through the gloom. It wasn't a basement. It was a corridor, low-slung and cramped, leading to a series of heavy, steel-reinforced doors. It felt wrong in a way that defied explanation. It felt like walking into a tomb that was still breathing. I could hear something then, a faint, rhythmic scratching, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up straight. I wasn't looking for a fight, I was looking for intel. But when I reached the first door and pushed it open, the beam of my light fell on a space that was so wrong, so profoundly against the nature of the world, that I felt my stomach turn over. There was a man in the corner, his face obscured by the shadow of the low ceiling. He wasn't tied up and he wasn't armed. He was just sitting there, staring at the wall, his hands tracing patterns in the dirt of the floor. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't move. I called out to him, but the sound of my own voice startled me. It was too loud, too human. He just kept scratching at the wall, a slow, methodical movement that spoke of a mind that had gone somewhere else to survive. I panned my light around the room and I saw the others. A row of narrow, wooden cots, empty, save for the grime of decades. This wasn't a combat hideout. This wasn't a temporary stop for insurgents. It was a facility, a place where people were kept, a place that wasn't on any map I had ever seen, a place that didn't belong in any reality I had ever been trained to operate in. I backed out of the room, my breath coming in short, jagged bursts. My hands were shaking, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know what the next step was. I looked at the corridor ahead, the row of doors that seemed to stretch on into infinity, and I realized that I had stepped off the map entirely. I looked up the ladder, toward the sliver of sunlight filtering down from the kitchen, and for a second, it felt like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I wanted to climb back up, walk out the front door, and keep walking until I hit the ocean, but I couldn't. The mission was still there, a ghost of an objective that had suddenly transformed into something else, something heavier and more terrible than a firefight. I stood there in the dark, the weight of my rifle heavy on my sling, and I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. Miller was coming down. He was going to see what I saw. I wanted to scream at him to stay back, to turn around and run, but my throat was a desert. The hatch above us began to slide open, blocking out the sun, and the silhouette of his helmet darkened the entrance, casting a long, jagged shadow that crawled toward me across the floor like a spreading stain. Miller hit the bottom of the ladder with that familiar, heavy thud of his combat boots, his breathing shallow and quick, the way it always was when we were tight on time. He didn't say a word at first, just swept his own light across the cramped, humid space, his head swiveling like a bird's, catching the damp walls and the low ceiling that seemed to press down on us with the weight of the entire city above. When his beam finally landed on that first door I'd cracked open, he stopped. I watched his shoulders go rigid, that specific familiar tension that took over his frame whenever he saw a contact, but this was different. He wasn't tracking an enemy, he was trying to process the absence of one. He looked at the man in the corner, still tracing those impossible lines in the dirt, and then he looked back at me. There was no tactical analysis in his eyes, no command, no assessment of the threat level. There was just a raw, hollow kind of confusion, the look of a man who just discovered that the floor he was standing on was made of glass, and he'd already shattered it. Miller was the guy who could make a joke out of a blown tire in the middle of a mortar strike, the guy who carried a crumpled, dog-eared copy of a crossword puzzle he'd been trying to finish for 3 weeks, and seeing him silent like that, seeing him look small in the dim light of that god-forsaken tunnel, felt like the ground beneath me had actually dropped away. We didn't speak because there weren't words for a place like that. We moved down the corridor, our boots making no sound on the packed earth, our hearts slamming against our ribs. We opened the second door, and the air hit us, a mix of stale sweat, untreated infection, and something sharper like ammonia. There was no one in that room, just a chair made of PVC pipe and duct tape, a bucket in the corner, and a single, child-sized shoe lying in the center of the floor, perfectly still. I stared at that shoe. It was yellow, scuffed at the toe, the kind of sneaker you'd see a kid wearing at a park back in Ohio. It was so out of place that it felt like a violent intrusion. I reached out to touch it, then stopped, my hand hovering in the stagnant air, afraid that if I disturbed it, the whole reality of the room would shift and swallow us whole. Miller nudged my shoulder, a gentle, grounding touch that reminded me I was still tethered to him, and we moved to the next door. Every room was a variation of the same nightmare, empty, stripped of humanity, marked by the echoes of people who had been reduced to nothing more than property. We were moving with a strange, dreamlike caution, stepping over discarded rags and empty plastic bottles, our tactical training screaming at us to clear the sector while our human instincts were begging us to climb out and never look back. I caught Miller looking at a mark on the wall, a series of tallies etched deep into the stone. He touched it with his gloved finger, tracing the lines, and I saw his jaw clench. He didn't look at me, but I knew what he was thinking. We weren't soldiers anymore. We weren't SEALs on an objective. We were ghosts haunting a ruin, witnesses to a crime that didn't have a name. The silence down there was heavy, a physical force that pressed against our eardrums, and every time the metal frame of a door groaned, it sounded like a scream. The hallway ended at a heavy, bolted iron grate. Beyond it, there was another space, darker, colder, where the shadows seemed to pool like black water. I pointed my light through the slats, and the beam cut through the dust to illuminate a heavy steel chain bolted into the concrete floor. It was cold, industrial, and utterly heartless. I felt a surge of something hot and jagged in my chest, a rage so pure and so overwhelming that it blinded me for a second. I wanted to kick the door down. I wanted to burn the whole place to the ground, but I knew that wouldn't change what was already behind us. We'd come here looking for insurgents, looking for the people who were lobbing rockets at our base, but we'd stumbled into something far darker, something that made the war feel like a sideshow. Miller leaned in next to me, his breath warm on my neck, and he whispered, his voice cracking, that we needed to get out. It wasn't an order, it was a plea. We were losing ourselves in that dark, and the longer we stayed, the more the horror of it started to seep into our own blood. We turned back toward the ladder, our movements slower, heavier now. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those doors opening, half expecting to see the people who had been kept there, but there was only the suffocating, empty dark. When we reached the base of the ladder, the man in the corner was still there, his fingers still dragging through the dust, still humming that low, tuneless sound that seemed to vibrate in the foundation of the house. I stopped. I wanted to help him, to take his arm, to drag him into the light, but I knew if I touched him, he might just shatter. He was beyond anything we could offer. We were soldiers, not healers, and the chasm between what we could do and what needed to be done felt like an infinite drop. Miller pulled me toward the ladder, his grip firm, and we climbed, the light from the kitchen growing brighter, more agonizingly normal with every rung. The moment my head cleared the floorboards, the glare of the desert sun hit me like a physical blow. The air above smelled of dry heat and ozone, a sharp contrast to the damp, putrid scent of the cellar. I stood in the kitchen, trembling, my gear feeling like leaden armor, the silence of the house now feeling like a trap. I looked at Miller. He had his helmet off, his hair matted with sweat, his face pale and drawn. He didn't look like the guy who told jokes at the dive bar in Virginia Beach anymore. He looked like an old man who had seen the end of the world and realized it wasn't a fiery apocalypse, just a quiet, dark basement in the middle of a nowhere town. He walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the street, his posture slumped, his hands hanging limp at his sides. We didn't report it. Not then. We sat in the kitchen, the sunlight slanting across the dust motes, and for a long time we didn't say a word. The rest of the team was outside, setting up a perimeter, their voices muted and distant, sounding like they were on the other side of a thick pane of glass. I looked at the floor, at the gap in the boards, and I felt a nausea so deep I thought I might actually pass out. The mission had been a success on paper. We'd cleared the structure, but the weight of what we'd found wasn't something you could put in a field report. It wasn't data. It was a scar, one that would sit beneath our skin for the rest of our lives. I pulled the picture of Sarah from my pocket, her smile bright and vibrant against the drab, ruined walls of that kitchen, and I felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. I couldn't look at her. The world she represented felt a million miles away, a dream I had once had back when I thought life made sense. Then a sudden, sharp crack echoed from the street, a single shot, crisp and sudden, followed by the frantic chatter of comms. It broke the spell. The war wasn't over just because we'd found a basement of shadows. The war was still happening, still waiting for us to step back into its rhythm. Miller slammed his helmet back on, his face instantly hardening back into the mask of the operator, the shift so fast and so violent that it made my head spin. He looked at me, and for a split second the fear was there, raw and unfiltered, before it was swallowed by the cold, tactical necessity of the moment. We moved to the door, stepping over the threshold, and the heat of the afternoon swallowed us. Everything outside was the same, the crumbling walls, the dust, the blinding, uncaring sun, but everything was different. I was carrying the basement with me now, the weight of those doors, the scratch of that man's finger, the hollow, empty rooms. The firefight was quick, brutal, and utterly forgettable. We returned fire, moved to cover, and watched as the enemy faded into the shadows of the alleyways, as they always did. It was a skirmish, a ripple in the fabric of the day, but it felt like a lifetime had passed between the first shot and the last. When the dust settled, we were standing in the middle of the street, our weapons hot, our eyes scanning the rooftops. I looked at Miller, and he was checking his mag, his movements efficient and robotic. We were back to the job. We were back to being the cog in the machine. But the silence between the shots was different now. It was full of the ghost hollow spaces we'd just crawled out of. We were supposed to be the hunters, the ones who brought order to the chaos, but I felt like nothing more than a witness to a wreckage that we couldn't ever pull ourselves out of. That night, back at the FOB, the air was thick with the smell of diesel generators and the distant, constant hum of the base. We sat in the mess hall, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting a harsh, artificial glare on our faces. The other guys were talking, joking about the day's patrol, the way they always did to burn off the adrenaline, but Miller and I sat in silence, our trays of gray, unidentifiable food in front of us. I couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that dark, narrow hallway, looking at that yellow shoe. I looked at my hands, the knuckles bruised and stained with dust, and wondered how they could ever feel clean again. Miller poked at his tray with a plastic fork, his movements slow and deliberate. He finally looked up at me, his eyes tired, the light in them dimmed, and he whispered that he hadn't told the others. He didn't have to explain why. We both knew that if we spoke about it, if we gave it a name, it would become real in a way that we couldn't survive. It would shatter the team. It would destroy the rhythm. So we buried it. We pushed the memory into a corner of our minds and built a wall of silence around it, pretending we were still the same men who had stepped off that plane weeks ago. But the silence wasn't a seal. It was a sieve. Over the next few days, the tension in the team grew, a taut, vibrating wire that threatened to snap. Every time we went on patrol, I found myself scanning the buildings not for threats, but for that same hidden quality, that feeling of something rotting just beneath the surface. I was looking for basements, looking for hidden doors, looking for the places where the horror was being stored. And Miller, he changed. He started losing things, his knife, his canteen, his concentration. He'd be mid-sentence and just stop, his eyes tracking something that wasn't there, his jaw working as if he were chewing on a bitter truth. I watched him, and my heart ached for him because I knew he was carrying his half of the basement, and it was crushing him, just like it was crushing me. We were two halves of a whole that had been broken, trying to keep up the pretense that we were still whole. The heat didn't break. It just got worse, a relentless, dry fire that seemed to strip the moisture right out of our bones. We spent our days in a haze of patrol and our nights in a haze of sleeplessness, listening to the mortar fire that punctuated the darkness like a heartbeat. One night while we were on watch, Miller started talking about that crossword puzzle again. He talked about how much he wanted to finish it, not because he cared about the clues, but because he just wanted one thing, one single, simple thing to have a definitive answer. He laughed, a short, brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes, and said that maybe the answers weren't meant to be found. I listened, my back against the sandbags, looking up at the stars that looked so cold and distant, and I realized he was right. We were in a place where answers didn't exist. There was only the experience, only the weight of it, only the slow, grinding process of being broken down into something that could survive the next day. I thought about Sarah. I thought about the ring in the hollowed-out book back in Ohio, and for the first time, I couldn't picture her face. I could see the photograph in my locker, I could see the way her hair fell, but I couldn't feel the person. The distance wasn't just physical, it was an existential chasm. I was no longer the man who had bought that ring. That man had died in the basement, in that dark, stale, suffocating room. The man who was left was something else, something sharper, something colder, something that knew things that no one back home would ever understand. And that realization terrified me more than the war ever had. It was a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight, a coldness in the center of my chest that no sun could ever warm. We went out the next morning on a routine sweep. The city was quiet, a deceptive, heavy stillness that felt like a held breath. We moved through the streets, our boots crunching on the glass, our eyes scanning the shadows. I felt like a stranger in my own body, watching myself walk, watching myself navigate the obstacles, as if I were a ghost inhabiting a suit of tactical gear. We passed the house, the one with the basement, and I felt a magnetic pull, a sickening, terrifying urge to turn back, to go down there again, to see if it was still there, to see if the man was still scratching at the wall. I forced myself to look away, but the image of it was burned into my retina, a permanent, searing mark. Miller stumbled, his foot catching on a piece of rebar, and he fell hard. He didn't get up. He just lay there, face down in the dust, his rifle clattering against the concrete. I rushed to him, my hands shaking, my mind screaming that he'd been hit, but he wasn't. He was just lying there, his breathing deep and ragged. I flipped him over and his face was gray, his eyes wide and unfocused, staring at the sky. He looked at me and he started to laugh, a soft, bubbling sound that grew and grew until it was a harsh, hysterical braying that echoed off the crumbling walls. I grabbed his shoulders and shook him, trying to snap him out of it, but he just kept laughing, his body shaking with the force of it. The other guys were running toward us, their faces masks of concern and alarm, but I just held him, trying to ground him, trying to bring him back from wherever he had gone. The laughter died out as quickly as it had started, leaving him gasping for air. He gripped my arm, his fingers digging into my muscle, and he leaned in close. He whispered that he could hear them, that he could hear the scratching, even out here in the middle of the street under the open sky. He was shaking, a deep primal tremor that I could feel through my own skin. I held him there in the middle of the road, the dust swirling around us, the tension in the air snapping like a dry twig. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fix a mind that had been broken by the silence of a basement. I just held him, and for the first time I felt the full, crushing weight of the love I had for him, a love that was defined not by joy or shared laughter, but by the terrible, shared knowledge of the dark. We got him back to the FOB, walking him in, the others looking at us with a mixture of confusion and guarded concern. We didn't tell them what happened. We told them it was the heat, that he'd had a spell. They believed us because they wanted to believe us, because they didn't want to know the truth. We got him to his rack, and he fell asleep instantly, a deep, comatose slumber that looked like death. I sat on the edge of my own rack, watching him, listening to the rhythmic, labored sound of his breathing. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering lamp in the hallway. I felt a sudden, sharp, and overwhelming desire to run, to get on a plane, to fly back to Ohio, to go to that house on Route 42, to find that book, to take out that ring, and to pretend that none of this had ever happened. But I knew I couldn't. The basement was a part of me now. It was in my blood, in my lungs, in the way I held my rifle, in the way I looked at the world. I was a man who had seen the dark, and you don't walk out of the dark without carrying some of it with you. I lay down, the canvas of the cot rough against my back, and I closed my eyes. I was waiting for the sleep, for the oblivion, but it didn't come. Instead, I was back in the hallway, the iron grate in front of me, the cold, industrial weight of the chain against my palm. I was back in the room with the yellow shoe, and I was back in the corner with the man who was still scratching, his finger bleeding, his wall a testament to a timeline that had stopped for everyone but him. The morning came, a harsh, unforgiving light that bled through the gaps in the metal walls. I got up, my body aching, my mind feeling like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper. I looked over at Miller's rack. It was empty. The bed was made, the sheets pulled tight in that precise, military fold that he'd obsessed over since boot camp. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I walked out into the compound, the air already warming, the smell of burnt trash and diesel thick in my throat. The other guys were gathered by the vehicles, their faces grim, their voices low. I walked toward them, my heart hammering a warning, the sound of the bass around me falling away into a muffled, distant roar. They looked at me as I approached, their expressions a mix of pity and fear, and I knew before they spoke. I knew because the world had shifted again, the floor had dropped out, and the vacuum had finally caught up to us. Miller wasn't in the mess hall. He wasn't on the schedule. He wasn't anywhere. They told me he'd gone out to the edge of the perimeter before dawn, and he hadn't come back. They said it was an accident, a trip, a misstep, a lapse in judgment, but I knew. I knew he hadn't walked away. He had simply reached the end of his capacity to remain in this world. He had gone back to the dark, and he had decided that the only way to escape it was to let it swallow him whole. The next few hours were a blur of reports, of frantic searches, of questions I couldn't answer and observations that meant nothing. I was a phantom, a shell, moving through the motions of a life that no longer had a center. I felt nothing, not grief, not anger, not fear. I felt like a hollowed-out tree, standing still in a forest that was burning all around me. They found his gear at the edge of the perimeter, neatly arranged, his rifle leaning against a sandbag, his dog tags resting on top of the pile like a discarded identity. He was gone, and the world just kept moving. The sun kept shining, the generators kept humming, The war kept demanding more of us, as if Miller had never existed, as if he hadn't been the guy who told jokes in the mud, as if he hadn't been the guy who had stood with me in the dark and felt the same weight I did. I went back to our quarters and sat on his rack. I touched the blanket, the fabric rough and familiar, and I smelled the faint, lingering scent of his laundry detergent, a smell from home, a smell of Ohio, a smell of the life we were supposed to have been living. I picked up the crossword puzzle he'd left on his bedside table. It was nearly finished. Only a few words remained, a few stray intersections he hadn't managed to crack. I stared at them, the ink faded, the paper yellowed, and I realized that he'd been trying to fill in the blanks of a life that had already been written for us. He'd been trying to find the meaning, and the meaning wasn't there. There was only the process, the struggle, the slow, inevitable erosion. I heard the door open, but I didn't turn around. I didn't care. I felt the presence of someone else, a heavy, silent weight in the doorway, but I was still in the basement, still standing in the dark, looking at the wall, waiting for the scratching to stop. I felt a hand on my shoulder, a firm, grounding touch, and I looked up. It was the commander, his face weathered, his eyes hard and unreadable. He told me they were going to continue the mission, that we had to move out, that the schedule didn't wait for the missing. He spoke in the tone of a man who was reading from a script, but underneath I heard the same hollow exhaustion I felt in my own marrow. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were survivors of a different kind of war, the kind that happened in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between the lines. I stood up, my joints stiff, and I took my gear. I didn't look at Miller's rack again. I didn't look at the crossword puzzle. I just walked out into the sunlight, my body heavy, my mind a blank slate. I felt like I was walking on air, like the ground had finally ceased to be a solid thing. We boarded the Humvee, the engine rumbling to life, the vibrations rattling my teeth. We pulled out of the gate, heading back into the city, back into the labyrinth, back into the places where the shadows hid the things that shouldn't exist. I looked out the window, at the passing walls, at the faces of the people we passed, and I felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of detachment. I was here, but I wasn't. The war was here, but it wasn't. We were drifting through a reality that had lost its moorings, a world that was spinning off into the dark. I leaned my head against the cool metal of the window, the vibration of the vehicle humming against my skull, and I realized that I would never be able to tell this story. I would never be able to explain the basement, or the yellow shoe, or the sound of Miller laughing in the street, or the way he simply vanished into the silence. These things didn't fit into the story of a soldier coming home. They didn't fit into any story at all. They were just the wreckage, the debris of a life that had been shattered in a basement in Ramadi, and no matter how far I went, no matter how many years I spent trying to build something new, I would always be down there, standing in the dark, waiting for the scratching to stop. The Humvee jolted as we hit a pothole, the metal frame groaning in protest. I looked at the man sitting next to me, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, his face still round with the softness of youth, his eyes bright with a naive, unearned sense of purpose. He was humming a song, a quiet, rhythmic melody that reminded me of something I'd heard on the radio back in Ohio. I looked at him and I felt a surge of something like pity, but it was sharper, colder. I wanted to warn him. I wanted to grab him by the collar and tell him that he was already a ghost, that the basement was waiting for him, that the world he was fighting for didn't exist anymore. But I didn't. I just sat there, my hands folded on my rifle, watching the world blur past, feeling the heat rising off the asphalt, and waiting for the next, inevitable moment when the floor would drop out again. We turned onto a narrow, congested street, the buildings pressing in on us, the windows above us like dark, unblinking eyes. I felt that familiar prickle at the base of my neck, the sensation of being watched, of being hunted, of being caught in the gaze of something that didn't care about our mission, our parameters, or our survival. I checked my weapon, the slide clicking home with a sound that felt like a death knell in the silence of the vehicle. I felt the weight of the moment, the tension in the air like a stretched wire, and I just knew, that we were heading toward another basement, another hidden place, another secret that would tear us apart. The driver slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a halt as a pile of rubble appeared in the center of the road. It wasn't an obstacle, it was a barricade. I saw the movement in the windows above us, the flash of steel, the glint of a rifle barrel catching the sun. The team erupted into motion, doors swinging open, gear clattering, shouts echoing in the narrow corridor of the street. I jumped out, my boots hitting the pavement, the dust rising around me in a choking, blinding cloud. The air was suddenly full of sound, the crack of rifles, the thud of impacts, the desperate, shouted commands, but I was still. I was standing in the center of it, the world moving at warp speed around me, and I was back in that kitchen, looking at that hatch, feeling the stale, metallic taste of the dust. I moved forward, my rifle raised, my heart hammering a rhythm that was no longer my own. I saw the house, the one with the barricade, the one that looked like it had been standing there for 1,000 years. I saw the door, the wood splintered and gray, and I knew what was behind it. I knew what was waiting for me. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just pushed forward, my body a weapon, my mind a void, my life a single, continuous, unbroken string of moments that had no beginning and would have no end. I reached the door, I kicked it, and it swung open, revealing the same dark, suffocating hallway, the same low, damp ceiling, the same rows of iron-reinforced doors. I stepped inside, the light from the street cutting a thin, jagged line across the floor, and I saw them. They were there just as I had known they would be. They were huddled in the corners, their eyes wide, their faces gaunt, their bodies broken by the weight of their own existence. I dropped my rifle, the sound of it hitting the concrete floor muffled and small, and I knelt. I didn't care about the combat. I didn't care about the mission. I didn't care about the war. I reached out to them, my hands shaking, my breath coming in jagged, uneven gasps, and I saw the recognition in their eyes, a flicker of hope that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. One of them, a girl with hair like spun silk and eyes that had seen too much, reached out and touched my hand. Her skin was cold, like ice, and the contact sent a jolt of electricity through my body that made my heart stop. I looked at her and I saw my own reflection in her gaze, the ghost I had become, the man who had lost his soul in a basement and was still searching for it. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there in the center of the room, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 nights, and I let the weight of it finally, truly, and irrevocably settle into my bones. The fighting continued above us, the shouts, the gunfire, the chaos, but it all felt 1,000,000 miles away. I was here, I was present, and I was finally, truly, and completely alone. The girl squeezed my hand, a small, fragile, and desperate movement that was the only thing holding me to the earth. I felt a tear run down my cheek, the first one I'd shed since I'd left home, and it tasted of salt, of memory, and of the long, long road that had led me to this moment. I looked around the room, at the cots, at the chains, at the remnants of a life that had been stripped away, and I realized that I wasn't just here to witness it. I was here to be a part of it. I was here to carry the memory of it, to carry the weight of it, to carry the truth of it, for as long as I lived. And as the sounds of the battle above began to fade, replaced by the deep, resonant silence of the cellar, I closed my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to run. I just wanted to be. I wanted to hold the weight of it, to feel the cold of it, to honor the truth of it, even if it destroyed me in the process. Because this, I knew, was the only thing that was real. Everything else, the war, the mission, the life back home, it was all just a veneer. This was the core. This was the truth, and it was all I had left. The transition from the heat of the street to the quiet, recycled air of the troop transport plane felt like stepping through a liquid barrier. We were silent. Not the silence of a tactical pause, but the heavy, leaden quiet of men who had finished their task and were no longer sure what they were supposed to do with their hands. I remember looking at my boots. They were stained with the dust of a country I didn't want to remember and couldn't figure out how to forget. We weren't talking about the basement. We weren't talking about Miller. We weren't talking about the fact that we were leaving behind a version of ourselves that we wouldn't be able to retrieve if we went back 1,000 times. The plane took off, and I watched the lights of the base shrink until they were just embers in a dark, infinite sea. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I just saw that yellow shoe, over and over, hanging in the void of that dark room. The flight back to the States was 30 hours of trying to find a position that didn't hurt. My knees, my back, my shoulders, everything was screaming. When we touched down at night, the air felt different. It was cool, and it carried the scent of rain on asphalt, a smell so aggressively American that it made my teeth ache. I walked off that plane and onto the tarmac, and I remember looking at the guys around me. We looked like we'd walked through a fire that hadn't quite finished burning us. My wife, Elena, was waiting for me. I saw her standing by the gate, her coat pulled tight, her eyes scanning the crowd with a desperation that made my gut turn over. When she saw me, she didn't run. She didn't wave. She just went perfectly still, as if she were trying to make sure I was actually the person she remembered before she committed to the distance between us. The hug was the hardest thing I have ever done. Her arms around me felt like a physical weight, a warmth I hadn't felt in months, but it was wrong. I was too hard, too cold, too full of that subterranean dark. I held her, but my hands stayed clenched at my sides, my muscles locked in a defensive posture that wouldn't let go. That first night in our bedroom was a disaster of quiet. The house felt like a museum of a life I'd lived in a different century. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the sound so strange and rhythmic that I couldn't stop tracking it. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark and watched the streetlights cast long, shivering shadows across the carpet, waiting for the floor to drop out, waiting for the scratching to start again. The weeks that followed were a long, jagged blur of trying to be normal while carrying a secret that felt like a tumor. I went to the grocery store with Alina, and the sheer volume of choices, the rows of cereal, the different types of milk, the bright, aggressive packaging, made me feel like I was going to lose my mind. I stood in the aisle, my heart slamming, trying to remember how to be a person who cared about which brand of coffee to buy. Alina would touch my arm, her voice gentle, asking me what was wrong, and I couldn't tell her. How do you tell someone you love that the reason you can't look at the dinner table is because you're busy measuring the structural integrity of the floorboards? I stopped talking. I just moved through the house, a ghost in my own life, watching them live in a world that felt like a fragile, paper-thin curtain stretched over a bottomless pit. There was a Thursday evening, about 3 months in, when I finally tried to laugh. We were at dinner with some friends, and someone told a joke about a bad day at the office. Everyone started chuckling, the sound easy and light, and I joined in, trying to participate, trying to build a bridge back to the land of the living. But then I caught the look on a friend's face, that casual, unburdened expression, and the contrast was so violent it stopped the air in my lungs. I went from laughing to a state of absolute, icy detachment in a single second. I put my fork down, stood up, and walked out of the house. I ended up sitting in the driveway in the rain for 3 hours, just listening to the crickets, trying to convince myself that I wasn't still in that hallway. Alina found me there, sitting on the wet pavement, and she didn't ask me to come in. She just sat down in the mud next to me and leaned her head on my shoulder. She didn't say a word. She just held me until the sun came up. I went to the VA because that's what you do. I sat in a beige room with a man who smelled like stale tobacco and spoke in a voice that was too calm, too practiced. He asked me about my deployment, and I talked about the patrols, about the heat, about the boredom, but I never told him about the basement. I couldn't. It felt like if I gave that memory to him, it would lose its weight, or worse, it would be treated like a symptom to be medicated away. I took the pills they gave me, but they just made the world feel like it was underwater. I didn't want to be numb. I wanted to be whole. I wanted to be the guy who could walk into a kitchen without scanning for hidden compartments. I wanted to be the guy who could hold his wife's hand without feeling like I was protecting a fragile object that was about to shatter. I found my peace in the woodshop. It was a small shed in the back of the house, a place where the air smelled of cedar and sawdust, a place where I could control the variables. I started building furniture. Simple things, stools, bookshelves, tables. I liked the math of it. I liked the way a joint, if cut with perfect precision, would fit together and hold its own weight. I spent hours in there, the rhythm of the saw, the bite of the chisel, the slow, methodical process of taking something raw and shaping it into something that had a purpose. It was the only time the world felt quiet. It was the only time I wasn't waiting for something to explode. I'd be sanding a piece of cherry wood, the grain smooth under my palm, and for a few minutes I'd forget about Ramadi. I'd forget about Miller. I'd just be a guy making a chair. It didn't fix it. The guilt didn't go away. It just became a roommate I'd learned to live with. Some nights the dream returns. I'm back in the tunnel and I'm reaching for the latch, and the smell of the damp earth is so thick I can taste it. But I don't wake up screaming anymore. I wake up, I sit up, and I breathe. I feel the weight of the blankets, the steady, rhythmic breathing of my wife beside me, the cool air of the bedroom. I remind myself, I am here, I am not there. The war is a continent away, a different reality, a different life. I am a man who builds things now. I am a man who tries to fix the broken edges of his own life with glue and patience. I know I'll never be who I was before I walked down those stairs. That boy died in the dark, and I've learned to accept the man who crawled out. I don't look for sympathy. I don't need anyone to tell me it wasn't my fault, because I know that's not the point. The point is that I survived, and surviving is a responsibility. You carry the ones who didn't come back, and you carry the ones you couldn't save, and you walk forward with that weight because it's the only way to honor what you saw. I still love Sarah, or the memory of her, and I love Alina, and I love the life I've built here, even if it feels a little bit like a ghost story. I have hope. It's not the bright, soaring hope of a 20-year-old, but it's a quiet, stubborn thing that lives in the corner of my shop. I'm sitting here now in the middle of the night, with the coffee gone cold and the house perfectly still around me. The light from the porch casts a long, thin beam through the window, hitting the edge of a mahogany table I finished yesterday. It's sturdy, it's balanced, it's exactly what it's supposed to be. I look at it, and I think about Miller, and I think about that yellow shoe, and I think about the man scratching in the dust. And I realize that I am still here, and I am still standing, and that has to be enough. I don't need the answers anymore. I've stopped trying to finish the puzzle. I'm just going to keep working until the sun comes up, and then I'm going to go inside and hold my wife's hand, and I'm going to try to be the man she deserves. The floor isn't going anywhere tonight, and for now, that's all I need to know. The hardest part about coming home isn't the nightmares. It's realizing that the world you left behind kept spinning without you.